Imagine a new mining project is proposed for your community, or maybe there's one already operating nearby. How do you really know it's doing right by the environment, by the people living there? Are there actual rigorous checks and balances in place, or is it more about just hoping for the best?
That's a really fundamental question. And thankfully, the answer is it's a lot more structured than just hope.
Okay.
For large-scale industrial projects like mining, the potential for impact is just immense. And so are the mechanisms designed to manage it, usually.
That's why today we're taking a deep dive into the critical processes that are meant to ensure mining projects are environmentally sound and socially responsible. Specifically, we'll unpack the Environmental and Social Impact Assessment, or ESA review process,
Yeah.
and then we'll move into the ongoing environmental mine audits that happen once a project is operational.
Exactly. And our mission for you really is to navigate these layers of scrutiny from the initial planning stages right through to active operations.
We want to reveal how experts work to identify potential issues, find solutions.
And yes, sometimes, how even with the best intentions, things can still go wrong. It happens.
Yeah. All of our insights today come from a critical review of source material, so we're offering you a shortcut, really, to understanding these incredibly complex but vital processes.
Okay, so let's get started. Let's begin at that very first gate, the ESD review.
Okay. So, from what I understand, the ETA itself is a prediction, right? It predicts impacts before a project even starts.
That's it.
But then there's this review process. What does that critical quality control step actually involve? And who are the key players making sure that forecast is accurate?
You're absolutely right. The ESA is the forecast. And the review is essentially the rigorous quality control of that forecast. It's often performed by independent external experts.
External.
Yeah. And crucially, the mining company itself scrutinizes the ESA internally before it's even submitted to government authorities for formal approval. This early internal review helps make sure the document meets their own standards and, importantly, that the proposed commitments are actually feasible.
So even before the regulators see it, the company is doing its own homework. And then government agencies conduct their own internal review for decision-making. That sounds like a significant amount of upfront vetting.
It is. And these reviews, they serve multiple purposes, often overlapping ones.
Like what?
Primarily, an ESHA review is part of the regulatory approval process. It judges if the document conforms to its specific terms of reference, the TOR, and all the relevant regulations.
Standard stuff.
But it's also a vital tool for collecting public opinions on a proposed project, giving communities a real voice.
That public input sounds absolutely essential, especially for projects with such huge community impact.
Exactly. And another critical purpose, maybe less obvious, is to assess compliance with specific international standards, like the Equator Principles.
The financial side.
Yes, these are often required by potential financial investors. So it's not just about satisfying legal requirements anymore, it's about financial viability and sticking to global best practices. It links environmental responsibility directly to the bottom line.
That's a huge insight. So who actually conducts these reviews? Is it always like a single government entity, or does it vary a lot?
Oh, it varies significantly by jurisdiction, which is fascinating, actually. In places like Canada or most Australian states, it's primarily an environmental government authority. Pretty straightforward.
Okay.
But in the USA and Indonesia, for example, you'll often find interagency committees. So they bring together different government departments.
More cooks in the kitchen, potentially.
Potentially, yeah. Then there are commissions of independent experts that in Thailand, Papua New Guinea, or the Australian state of Victoria, for instance.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's even just the planning authority guided by government guidelines. So yeah, quite a range.
That makes sense that there's no single model. But does this variety in who does the reviewing, does it imply different levels of rigor, maybe, or influence?
That's a really perceptive question.
What's the difference in outcome, maybe, or public trust when a commission of independent experts handles it versus, say, a government planning authority?
A commission of independent experts often brings a perception, at least, of higher impartiality and specialized technical depth, which can definitely bolster public trust and the technical rigor of the review. Government authorities, while knowledgeable, might sometimes be perceived as having political influences or maybe just resource constraints. So that structural difference can absolutely affect both the review's thoroughness and, crucially, how the public perceives its legitimacy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of the public, how exactly does the public review part work?
Public review is accommodated in many ESI systems by law. At a minimum, it means providing enough information and enough time for the public to comment.
Okay, the minimum bar.
Right. But international financing institutions, they often push for a more comprehensive and open process.
Like public hearings.
Exactly. Public hearings, open access to all the documentation for anyone interested. This not only gathers vital public perception, but usually requires the project proponent, the company, to formally respond to all the issues raised.
So the community's voice can actually shape the assessment and maybe even the project design.
Potentially, yes.
What about third-party review? That sounds like it adds another layer of objectivity.
It absolutely does. Third-party review involves truly independent experts, people with no vested interest in either promoting or opposing the mining project.
Just the facts.
Pretty much. Their specific role is to objectively demonstrate the technical accuracy and completeness of the ESIA, or identify any shortcomings. The focus here is almost entirely on the technical robustness of that document.
Got it. And then there's the internal review by financial institutions you mentioned. That seems less about public input and more about, well, financial risk.
Yes, exactly. International financial institutions, banks, and so on increasingly conduct their own internal environmental and social reviews of projects they're thinking about funding.
Makes sense.
The purpose is to ensure the project complies with their specific environmental and social policies, identify any financial risks tied to potential environmental problems, and just make sure it meets best industry practice. For banks that follow the Equator Principles, for example, it's basically a prerequisite before they'll commit any funds.
So if you're doing an ESHA review, what makes a good one? I saw something called the AAA test in the source material. Sounds like a checklist.
Yeah, the AAA test is a really excellent framework for assessing the quality of an ESHA review.
Okay, what are the A's?
So the first A is appropriateness.
Yeah.
Does the ESHA actually cover all the key issues and impacts that are relevant to this project in this place?
Makes sense.
The second A is adequacy. Is the impact analysis sufficiently thorough? Is it robust? Based on sound data and methods. And finally, actionability. Does the report give enough clear, concise information to enable truly informed decision-making by regulators, by stakeholders, by everyone involved?
And that distinction is important, isn't it? It's not about redoing the whole ESHI in the review.
No, exactly.
But rather making sure it's good enough that it's useful.
Precisely. It's about identifying strengths, weaknesses, omissions, or inaccuracies in the original document.
So what kind of specific criteria and focus areas do these reviews really zero in on, beyond just like the basic terms of reference?
Well, beyond that baseline TOR, reviews rigorously consider legal requirements, specific environmental guidelines, and also broader ESHA good practice. They often draw from international frameworks like those Equator Principles we mentioned.
So it's about not just meeting minimum local standard.
It's often striving for global best practices.
Can you give us some compelling examples of what these reviews really dig into? Maybe some areas that might surprise someone who just thinks of mining as digging stuff out of the ground.
Absolutely. Yeah. The sources highlight a really broad range, but some particularly compelling ones include biodiversity, making sure there were plans for conserving endangered species and critical habitats.
All right.
Cultural properties, that means protecting historical sites, religious sites, unique archaeological places that might be impacted. Very important. Global warming, specifically addressing methane emissions, which is a big one for coal mining, obviously.
Yeah.
Hazardous and toxic materials, requiring really robust plans for handling them safely, disposing of them properly.
Crucial.
And a really significant one, land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. This needs comprehensive, fair resettlement plans for any communities displaced by the project. That's huge.
Wow. That comprehensive scope, biodiversity, cultural sites, human resettlement, it really underscores how these projects touch almost every facet of life in a community.
Absolutely.
It makes the review process incredibly complex, doesn't it? And I read that if serious deficiencies are found, the review itself might have to expand into almost a mini ESIA to fill the gaps.
That can happen, yes.
Yeah.
It underlines how critical this initial gatekeeping step is.
But, as you said, the EHA review, no matter how thorough, is only the first step.
It is, because the predictions need to be checked against reality.
So the ESA review is our crucial initial filter. Got it. But what happens once a project does get the green light and operations actually begin? How do we make sure those predicted impacts don't become actual environmental disasters years later? That's where environmental mine audits come in, isn't it?
Exactly. If the ESA review is about predicting and planning, then environmental mine auditing is about evaluating the actual performance once the mine is up and running.
Like a financial audit, but for the environment.
That's a great analogy. Instead of balance sheets, it scrutinizes environmental performance and how effective the management systems are.
And just like financial auditors, these environmental auditors, they need to be independent and objective with legal liability for what they find.
Absolutely. That independence and liability are key. It gives their findings weight. The history of these audits is quite interesting, actually. Environmental auditing first really emerged in the U.S. back in the early 1970s.
Oh, that early?
Yeah. Multinational companies like General Motors were pioneering internal programs. It was a direct response to rising public environmental awareness and those landmark regulations like the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Clean Water Act of 1972.
So it started basically as just a compliance check. Are we breaking the law?
Initially, yes. Very much focused on compliance, finding violations. But the nature of environmental audits evolved pretty quickly. People realized they could go beyond just ticking boxes for regulations. They could analyze the root causes of why things weren't compliant. They could evaluate broader environmental risks, assess how well environmental management systems were actually working.
So they became more proactive, less reactive.
Exactly. Today's audits are as much management audits as they are compliance checks. They're really an essential part of environmental management worldwide now.
And for the mining industry specifically, audits seem crucial for trying to improve its often, let's face it, negative public image.
Yeah, that's definitely a driver.
We've all heard the stories about major incidents, tailings dam failures.
Unfortunately, yes. The mining industry constantly battles negative perceptions because of these well-publicized environmental disasters. Tailings dam failures, like you said, have caused immense harm and got global headlines.
Like where?
Incidents in Guyana, at the Mar Copper mine in the Philippines, or the widely publicized failure at Los Froiles in Spain. Big ones.
Right.
And the adverse publicity around the environmental damage from the OK Tedi mine in Papua New Guinea, that also powerfully shows how these environmental incidents can just reverberate globally for the entire industry.
Those are sobering examples. They really underscore the incredibly high stakes involved. So when we talk about different types of audits, what are the main categories? What's each one for?
Okay, there are several key types. First, you have compliance audits. These are often done annually. They check strict adherence to laws, regulations, and crucially, the commitments made back in the ESI.
Keeping promises.
Essentially, yes. Then you have benchmark audits. These compare a company's environmental performance against the very best industry practices to see where they can improve.
Aiming higher than just compliance.
Exactly. Then there are environmental liability audits. These are typically external audits, really important during mergers or acquisition.
Due diligence time.
Precisely. They identify potential environmental liabilities, hidden costs, really. These are often commissioned by investors or insurance companies doing their homework.
Assessing the financial baggage of environmental risk before a deal makes sense.
It does. And then you have environmental management system, EMS audits. These test compliance with formal, globally recognized standards like ISO 14000.
Checking the systems themselves.
And it's important to note that mine audits has special considerations. They're different from typical industrial audits because of the sheer scale of operations. Often they're really remote locations and the heightened public scrutiny they constantly face. This makes them prone to controversy and requires pretty unique expertise in the audit team.
That highlights the unique challenges. So who are the actual players in this audit process? You mentioned the team.
In any audit, you basically have three primary parties. There's the auditee, that's the operational unit being audited, the mine itself.
Okay.
Then the client who commissions the audit. This could be the mining company, its investors, maybe public authorities.
The one paying the bill.
Usually, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, the audit team, led by a qualified lead auditor.
Got it. And can you clarify the difference between the subject matter of the audit and the audit criteria? I think that's important.
Yes, good distinction. The subject matter is what is being audited. For instance, mine waste management or water discharge practices, or maybe even community relations programs. The what? The audit criteria are against what it's being checked. This could be host country laws, the Equator Principles, again, specific industry codes like the Cyanide Code for gold mines, or even internal company policies.
The how well.
Exactly, the standard it's being measured against.
So the auditors collect verifiable information and existing data to see if the subject matter meets the criteria. It seems important that auditors generally don't generate new information during the audit itself. Why is that distinction so critical?
It's critical because an audit isn't a research project. It's not a new environmental study. It's meant to be a snapshot, a verification exercise based on what's already there.
Okay.
Auditors are there to scrutinize existing data, documents, practices against established standards. If they start to generate new data, it would, well, introduce new variables, massively extend the timeline, and really blur the lines between an audit and a full-scale environmental assessment, which has different goals and needs different resources.
Right.
Their independence relies on evaluating what is, not creating what could be during that audit window.
That's a really key distinction. Okay, so walk us through the actual audit process then. How's it done? What are the steps?
Okay, it generally starts with the audit protocol. This is essentially the roadmap for the whole audit. The lead auditor prepares this, usually in consultation with mine management.
What does that protocol include? And how flexible is it? You mentioned mining operations are complex.
Right. The protocol defines the objectives and the scope, what's in, what's out, the specific audit criteria they'll use, which organizational units or departments will be audited, and the planned audit procedures.
Pretty detailed.
Yes, and crucially, it also includes confidentiality requirements. That's often a big deal in sensitive industries like mining.
I bet.
Now, for complex operations, it's usually designed as a general list of important topics rather than a super rigid step-by-step checklist.
Why is that?
That flexibility is vital, because a really detailed checklist might inadvertently force the audit into a narrow box and cause critical, unique issues at that specific complex mine site to be missed entirely. You need room for the auditor's judgment.
That makes a lot of sense, allowing for site-specific issues. And building the right audit team must be absolutely critical for this whole thing to work.
Well, it's arguably the most important step. Team selection is based on auditing experience, sure, but critically, also deep mining expertise. You need people who understand mining.
Right.
Plus, regulatory knowledge of the host country and especially cultural sensitivity. You're often working in very different cultural contexts. And crucially, at least one team member needs to demonstrate a full appreciation and understanding of social issues given the community impacts.
Not just the technical stuff.
Not just the technical stuff. And independence is paramount, as we said.
Yeah.
Auditors should never be accountable to the people whose work they are auditing. It's a tricky balance to get right.
I can imagine. So once the team is assembled, the protocol is set, what's the actual audit journey like on the ground?
It typically starts before they even get to the site with a pre-salt visit data review. The audit team gathers and reviews existing information operations data, monitoring reports, management plans, kind of homework.
Crucial groundwork.
Definitely. Then comes the site visit, which is really the heart of the audit.
Okay, what happens during that site visit? Break it down.
It kicks off with an opening meeting. Introductions all around, confirm the scope and objectives again, agree on a precise audit timetable, and crucially, review site safety and emergency procedures. Safety first.
Always.
Then comes interviews, lots of interviews, with mine personnel at various levels, from top management right down to the operators on the ground. This is a really key component.
Why are interviews so important?
Because auditors ask open-ended questions. They try to understand the organizational relationships, who's responsible for what, how things actually get done. And these interviews often reveal subtle but really significant differences between the documented procedures, what's on paper, and the actual day-to-day practices.
The gap between policy and reality.
Exactly.
That's critical. It means the best plans can fall apart in practice, and those interviews are key to catching that disconnect before it becomes a disaster. It's where the audit really goes beyond just a checklist, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's where the real insights often come from. Another critical part is the review of monitoring programs.
Checking the checks.
Pretty much. Auditors critically assess if the mine's monitoring adequately measures emissions to land, water, air, and importantly, are the results systematically reviewed? Are they looking for compliance trends or signs of impending problems?
So it ensures the management program has effective feedback loops, allows for early intervention.
Precisely. And then, after all that intensive work on site interviews, document reviews, site inspections, there's a closeout meeting with the mine's management.
Wrapping things up.
Yes. This meeting lets the audit team clarify any outstanding issues and gives initial feedback to management. The main point is for the team to present their preliminary findings so everyone understands them clearly.
And for management to respond?
Yes, for management to clarify any misunderstandings or maybe provide additional context they think is relevant. While disagreements can come up, the final decision on the significance of any findings ultimately rests with the lead auditor.
Okay, the buck stops there. Finally, there's the audit report. What does that look like? What's in it?
So a comprehensive written report is provided to the client. Remember, the client might be the company, investors, or government. And typically, a draft goes to the auditee, the mine, for comments and factual corrections first.
Fair enough.
The report details the audit objectives, the scope, the criteria used, lists the team members, and gives a summary of the audit process, what they did.
Standard reporting.
Yes, but a very important note. All audit reports have an inherent element of uncertainty
How?
because they're based on a snapshot in time with limited time and resources. The auditors can't check everything. So this limitation, this uncertainty, should always be clearly stated in the report.
Transparency about limitations.
Exactly. And the emphasis, ideally, should be constructive.
Yeah.
Focus on, here are areas where you can improve your environmental performance and mitigate risk, rather than just pointing fingers at non-compliance.
That seems like a good approach. Encouraging continuous improvement rather than just being punitive. But despite all these rigorous checks, ESI reviews, audits, the sobering reality is that sometimes things still go wrong. Unpredicted impacts still occur.
They do. It's unfortunately true. Occasionally, a mining project causes serious impacts that were just not predicted in the initial ESI. Or maybe they emerge years into operation when conditions change.
Are there well-known examples?
Yes. The sources mention both the OKG project in Papua New Guinea and the Grasberg copper project in Indonesia. Huge projects.
What happened there?
In both cases, mine wastes, tailings, were discharged into rivers with the expectation, based on modeling, that the rivers would naturally carry them out to the sea. Standard practice in some places historically.
But that's not what happened. The models were clearly wrong.
Precisely. In both instances, unexpectedly, the tailings were deposited on land outside the river channels, on floodplain, in forest, causing widespread forest loss, ecological damage, impacting communities downstream in ways that just weren't foreseen. The models used for the ESIA had predicted otherwise.
Wow. So that implies significant issues with the models themselves, or maybe the assumptions behind them, or the data fed into them.
Could be any or all of those. It really highlights a crucial vulnerability in the prediction process. Even with sophisticated tools, assumptions matter immensely.
So even with all that foresight and planning, what are the common causes of these unpredicted impacts, these nasty surprises?
Several factors often contribute. One significant cause is sometimes termed system overload.
Meaning?
For instance, a processing mill might operate consistently beyond its original design capacity to process more ore. This can lead to the receiving environment, the air, the water having its ability to absorb pollution, its assimilative capacity, exceeded much faster than predicted.
Pushing the limits.
Exactly. Or a tailings dam designed for a certain volume gets raised or expanded over time to accommodate more waste from processing more ore.
Which sounds efficient.
But it can, in some circumstances, fundamentally alter its stability characteristics, or how it behaves in a major flood, sometimes leading to catastrophic failure. It's crucial that any changes to a project during its operational life are thoroughly reassessed for their potential environmental consequences.
And that follow-up assessment often doesn't happen with the same rigor as the initial ECSI, does it?
Often not, no. It's a common gap.
Okay, so operational changes are one risk factor. What else contributes to these unforeseen problems?
Other causes include things like inadequate baseline data to begin with. Maybe the initial studies just didn't collect enough samples or didn't collect them often enough to really capture the full range of natural environmental variability like extreme floods or droughts.
So the predictions were built on an incomplete picture of reality.
Which makes the predictions less reliable. Also, sometimes there's a failure to identify all potential impact pathways.
Like missing something.
Yeah. For example, maybe the ESIO correctly predicted acid rock drainage, or ARD, from the main mine pit, but it missed the fact that building new access roads would cut through other areas of rock that also generate acid when exposed to air and water.
So you get unforeseen contamination from an unexpected source.
Exactly. And sometimes, sadly, it's simply human error, which can creep in due to complacency maybe, or just a lapse in vigilance after years of operation that seemed trouble-free.
That's a really sobering thought. Complacency kills, as they say. It makes you wonder, even with all these safeguards, how do you truly guard against basic human nature, that tendency to get comfortable?
It's a persistent challenge in any complex operation, not just mining.
Have you seen instances where just a simple oversight, maybe born from that complacency, had surprisingly far-reaching consequences?
Often it's not one single catastrophic error, but maybe a series of small deviations piling up. Overlooked warnings, minor procedure shortcuts that become normalized. they accumulate.
Death by 1,000 cuts, environmentally speaking.
Yeah, and this is where the importance of a robust, independent audit program really becomes clear again.
How?
Because a good audit program, conducted regularly by fresh eyes, is designed specifically to catch these kinds of drifts, these impending problems, before they escalate into significant, unpredicted damage. Audits can identify those subtle shifts in operation or maybe changes in baseline conditions that the people involved day to day might miss, but which, left unchecked, could lead to disaster.
So bringing it all together then, as you've heard, ensuring environmental and social responsibility in mining is this continuous, multi-layered process. It's complex, definitely fraught with challenges, but also involves incredible rigor when done right. The ESG reviews set the stage, trying to predict and plan for responsible mining.
And then the continuous environmental audits act as those vital checks and balances throughout a project's life, identifying issues, ensuring compliance, hopefully catching problems early. It's a dynamic and evolving field, really, where the goal is constant improvement and ever more sophisticated ways of managing risk.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given all these rigorous checks, all this expert oversight we've discussed, what truly makes the ultimate difference between a project that succeeds responsibly and one that ends up causing unpredicted serious harm?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and it's something to consider, perhaps, when you look at any large-scale industrial projects moving forward in the world today. What really tips the balance?